Peace from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. This phrase, good God, as we've talked about a couple of weeks ago on Ash Wednesday, we pick it back up this morning. Good God. It's a phrase that we've oftentimes used as a way of offering exasperation. Bless you, by the way, Anna. Good God. My gosh. Something along those lines. 2 words. And if we punctuate those words in different ways, as I said during the announcements, it tells us something about the nature of who our God is, and it also tells us about our faith as well. So what we're going to do, starting this morning, is pick back up on this idea of taking these 2 words and punctuating them in different ways to tell us during this Lenten season about who our God is and about how our faith acts in relation to Him. And this morning we start with transposition, which, for those of you grammar geeks out there, is not actually a punctuation mark. It is an editing mark. But bear with me for just a moment. We're going to use transposition today to talk a little bit about the proper order of things when it comes to these 2 words, good and God. Transposition in the editing world is the swapping of 2 words in a sentence in order to make a sentence sound better or make more sense. So in the case here, I wrote out, it essentially is the same thing. When by swapping essentially and is, it makes more sense to say it is essentially the same thing. When we transpose good and God, when we put the word God before the word good, effectively what ends up happening is God becomes the definer of the word good. When we say God good instead of good God, what we are saying is that God is defining what good is. And that, my friend, is the proper way for us to understand these 2 words and their relationship. The clearest place that we see this is in the story that Deb just read and Anna worked through with the kids, the creation story. God said, let there be, and I will now say and ask you to do what Anna said. God said, let there be, and God said it was what? Good. It was good. Notice, God says, God speaks any of these things into creation, and God is the one who assigns the value good to the things that He creates. That word good in Hebrew, which is the language in which Genesis was written, that word good literally means something that's pleasant both to the senses as well as to the higher nature, which is, the higher nature, of course, is God Himself. That which is good in the sense in which the writer of Genesis put it down in the first place are those things that are pleasing to the senses and also are simultaneously pleasing to God Himself. And where we end up seeing that most clearly is as we get into the Old Testament. Well, if you look up the word pleasing, 40 times, the first 40 instances have to do with the aroma of burnt offerings. Back in the old days, people would bring offerings to the temple, and they would do what? They wouldn't collect them in offering plates and go count them in the counting room. They would burn them on the altar. And that burning, that smell that went up to heaven, is what was pleasing to God. Literally, that offering was pleasing to God's senses. And because God said, this is what I count as good, that became the definition for what good means. It was true when the book of Genesis was written, and as God's people started to act in the way God wanted to, good was that thing that was pleasing to God's senses and pleasing to God Himself. And so, for example, we can say, and some would want to argue with you, that an affair outside of marriage is a good thing. That an affair outside of marriage, you got to understand, the person was not enjoying their marriage. The person was having a tough marriage and so forth. That does not rise to the definition of good. Why? Because while it may be pleasing to the person, it is never pleasing to God. And so we as human beings have wanted to co-opt the definition of good from its biblical grounding. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to call things good that God himself absolutely did not call good. And so when we run into these situations where we think something is good, but God does not say it's good, biblically speaking, it cannot be good. Good is that which is pleasing to God's senses as well as pleasing to God himself. And so God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them male and female. He created them. And that word image in Hebrew that the writer of Genesis uses is to say that God created male and female, Adam and Eve, to be kind of a shadow-like likeness, a form of him. Adam and Eve were a representation of God, very clearly saying they were not God, they were like God. Any of us, all of us, created by God, are not God. We have been created like God in his image. And maybe the easiest way to understand what that means in that Genesis way is the difference between the sun and the moon. The sun is the source of light. The sun is the source of heat. The sun is the source, one of the primary sources of life in our universe. Like Anna said, there are chemicals in the air that if they changed, we couldn't survive. Same thing with the sun. The sun changes, forget it, we're done. The moon is a different thing, though. We look up at the moon at night and we see the moon glowing. The moon casts light. But does the moon cast its own light? No. What is the moon doing? It's reflecting the light from the sun. And I looked it up. Scientifically speaking, the moon, the brightest moon that we ever see in the night sky, the fact that you can walk around in the dark and still see where you're going because of the moonlight, that's only reflecting about 12% of what the sun casts on it. The moon has the ability to cast light, not because the light comes from it, but because it simply is reflecting the light that's bouncing off of it from the sun. That is how we have been created by God. That is the proper understanding of what it means to be created in God's image. We are created in God's likeness, but we are a reflection of what God is. We are not God. We are created by God, and we are a likeness, a representation, a reflection of. We were created by God to be what? Genesis tells us that we are created by God to be pleasing in God's sight and to his higher nature. God saw that all that he'd made, and it was very good. That is literally, it was exceedingly, completely, utterly pleasant to every one of God's senses. We were created for the purpose of being pleasing to God. That is why we are here, my friends. And so what happened? We were created to be pleasing to God, to be a reflection of God in this world that he created. And what happened? Genesis chapter 2. We overreached. We got greedy. We weren't content to simply be what we were created to be. We weren't content to simply be pleasing to God and to have that perfect relationship with him. We wanted more. And as we know the story, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and note right here, we're still okay. She looks at the forbidden fruit. She sees that it's pleasing to the eye. She sees that it's good for food. No problem yet. But then what happens? She can't stop her overreach. And also, it was desirable for gaining wisdom so that she could be like God. And so she took it and she ate it. And she turned around and she said, "Here, Adam." And Adam didn't ask another question. Okay. Crunch. And there it is. The bottom line, my friends, is we overreached. We weren't content with being what God had created us to be. We wanted more. And when the serpent's temptation came out and said, you know what the problem is? God's holding out on you. The problem is that God knows that as soon as you eat of the fruit, you will be like him, knowing good from evil. It wasn't good enough to be created in God's image to reflect God. We had a chance to be on par with God. And when we were given that chance, a lie as it was, we took it. We needed more. We made it about our needs, not God's needs. And that's where everything became broken. We weren't content simply to reflect him. We wanted to be him. And once we wanted to be him, we ever since have had this terrible habit of taking that which God has created good, and we have made it into things that are not good. We still are overreaching to this very day. They say that power does what, my friends? Corrupts? Absolutely, right? And absolute power corrupts absolutely. How many of you guys know of Jacob Zuma? That name familiar? Anybody raise your hand? He was the president of South Africa until Valentine's Day. Part of the problem was Jacob Zuma had been elected as South Africa's president some years ago. And you know what? Important job. Following in the footsteps of Nelson Mandela. Come on, Nelson Mandela, coming out of apartheid, taking and deconstructing the apartheid system, creating South Africa into a country that was about as egalitarian as South Africa could become. Nelson Mandela is done being the president. Jacob Zuma takes over, and what ends up happening? Jacob Zuma decides, not so sure I want to be done being president. And Jacob Zuma, as you may have heard in the news, finally, as of Valentine's Day, was forced out by his own political party to step down and resign. Why? Power is not a bad thing. Responsibility is a good thing. God has created that for us, and we are to wield responsibility and power in godly ways. But what ends up happening? We overreach. And sometimes we think, this power stuff is pretty nice, and I don't want to let go of it. And what we see, not just Jacob Zuma, but all over the world. Just today in the news, I saw that China now is making it possible for Chairman Xi Jinping to remain in that position indefinitely, even though that's not been part of how they function. We get a little bit of power, and what do we like to do with it? Hang on to it as long as we can. Investing, stewarding our money, never a bad thing. This is what God tells us all over the Bible to do. And yet, once stewarding metastasizes into something it shouldn't be, what do we end up getting? How many of you guys recognize the picture up there? How many of you guys remember the name Bernie Madoff? That's Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff made a king's ransom, investing people's money. And he was making a good living at it. Here was the problem. What did Bernie Madoff not do with the money that was entrusted to him? He didn't invest it. He set up a Ponzi scheme. He set up a scheme where he was quite literally borrowing from Peter to pay Paul under the guise that these people's money, billions of dollars, had been invested and they would be returned. He left people penniless. And he's in prison for the rest of his life. Stewarding, managing financial resources is a good thing. But what happens is when we overreach, things and people like Bernie Madoff metastasize that into something that is not good. You even take things like the atomic bomb. You go back in history and you look at the decisions that needed to be made in 1945, and they were unenviable decisions. The decision fundamentally, simplistically put in a historical context, was Japan was not going to give up. They were not going to give up without a fight, and they were going to fight to the last person. That meant that the United States was going to have to lose hundreds of thousands more soldiers in order to get rid and finish up the war in the Pacific Theater. And then Oppenheimer and the rest of those folks discovered the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb could get the war done in a much shorter time with fewer casualties. And we're talking fewer, meaning hundreds of thousands. It would cost the Japanese hundreds of thousands. It would cost the United States hundreds of thousands fewer. The problem is this, my friend. We had an unenviable task in 1945 of what did we do, and we couldn't see into the future. And so I don't begrudge President Truman. I don't begrudge the people who had to make that decision. The problem is this, my friends. Once we got our hands on that kind of power, notice what's happened in our world ever since then. Now we are trying to make sure that certain states and certain governments don't get their hands on technology because they may not handle it in the same responsible way that we and the Russians have for the last 70 years. Polio. How many of you guys remember 1950s people suffering from polio being in iron lungs? Dreadful way for people to have to recover from polio. And the bottom line was, folks, we had polio eradicated in this country. Polio was gone. And what started to happen? Well, we haven't had polio in a while, so why worry about it? And we stopped inoculating ourselves against it. And guess what started happening? In places in the world where polio vaccines were not as available, polio came back. And now it's even come back to our country as well. We still are overreaching. We still are at a place, you look at technology now. Technology by itself is a good thing. Technology, when it is metastasized in the hands of people who wish to do ill, becomes a very, very not good thing. Our problem has always been, we're not content simply to please God. We want to be like God. We want to harness the power that God had. We want to use the power that we have. And the worst part of it is we don't want to do it in a way that glorifies God. We want to do it what? In a way that honors me. Our fundamental problem, my friends, is that when we put good before God, when we're the ones who define what good is and then put God secondary, it always ends up being about ourselves. And when it's about ourselves, it never works for long. Just ask the people who invested in Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. And that is the problem. We overreach. We're not content to merely be pleasing to God. We want to be God. We want God to be where we want God to be when we need Him, but then we want to be in control of our own destinies, and we want to have our own power as much as we want it. And so what do? How do we right that? I think we start by stopping our attempts to fix ourselves. This has always been the biggest problem that we as human beings face. We think we can fix ourselves. And every single chance we get to fix ourselves, we fail. Look at all the diets that we have in our world these days and how much the obesity epidemic is plaguing our country. And you will see right there, just in that one example, of how much we do in terms of a good job of fixing ourselves. We got to stop trying to fix ourselves, and we need to cling to a different beginning. The beginning that we were offered at the beginning. The beginning that we're offered in Mark's gospel. The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah. We need to let God transpose us back and not have us defining what good is, but let God define what good is. That's how it was originally. God created it, He saw it, and it was good. Did we say what was good? No. God defined what was good. God defined for us what was pleasing to His senses and what was pleasing to Him. That's what we've got to do, is we've got to allow God to transpose us back to being after Him. We need to yield and let God define what is good. And guess what? If that doesn't match what we think is good, brothers and sisters, too bad. It's not ours to define. God defines what is good, and we are called to yield to God's definition of what is good. We are called to be those who are pleasing to God in his sight. And we do that by following the lead of Jesus Christ. When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, his prayer, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Even God himself, made flesh, yielded to his Creator, to his Father, and said, here's what I want. I do not want to have to suffer this gruesome crucifixion tomorrow. I'm dreading it more than anybody could dread anything in the world. And yet, here's the thing. It's not about what I want. It's about what you want. And in that moment, bless you, what Jesus did was he yielded to what God needed in order for there to be good in the world. In order for the rest of us to be able to be fixed, God had to have it this way. And Jesus had to yield to it. He didn't like it. It was terrible. And yet he did it. He put himself after God. And that is what we are called to do. And so following Christ's lead, the way we fix this is we do what we were created to do. Deuteronomy 10. And now Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Where are we in that picture? Where is it about me in that picture? It's not there, is it? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, Micah says. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. As we start this Lenten season, and we take this phrase, good God, and we begin to punctuate it in different ways, what we learn today is that we as human beings have a nasty habit of wanting to define what is good in our world. And when we do that, we oftentimes end up overreaching. And we take what God has said is good and we make it not good. To begin fixing that, we take the Holy Spirit that God has gifted us and we yield to it, and we allow ourselves to be put into proper perspective with God. God comes first. Good comes second. And we allow God to define what that good is. And in response to that, we act justly. We love mercy. We walk humbly with our God. And we reflect those things to the world around us. The Lord be with you. Amen. All right, at this time,